Yesterday, I discussed how Russian officials have now taken to discussing the situation in Bakhmut as indeed now a cauldron situation. And we've had more comments about this over the course of the last couple of hours. There's also been reports, again from Russian officials, about how some Ukrainian troops are trying to escape the cauldron. And we've had a comment from Yan Gagin, who is somebody we've heard of many times, an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting leader of the Donetsk People's Republic. Anyway, he said on Russia 24 television this morning that small groups have been fleeing Bakhmut on the dirt roads. And he went on to say, I do not rule out attempts to break out of the city itself, as small groups of Ukrainian troops have been retreating in a chaotic manner. And the implication is that this is something which is happening without direct orders from Kiev or the Ukrainian command. Whether that is so or not, I don't know. But when Gagin uses the word chaotic, that suggests that some people in Bakhmut are basically now trying to escape the encirclement and are taking decisions into their own hands. Anyway, there's been a lot of other comments about the state of things in Bakhmut, and we've had more comments from Yan Gagin about the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut. Again, it's in the same interview on Russia 24. He said that the city of Bakhmut, which Kiev has for some time described as the Ukrainian forces' impregnable fortress, has turned into a veritable black hole. He, President Vladimir Zelensky, has long called it a fortress city, the loss of which, in principle, would be tantamount to the loss of the front line. The fortress city has now turned into a black hole that sucks in enemy manpower. And there's on that last point, Gagin discusses what the Ukrainians are doing in terms of trying to reinforce their positions in Bakhmut. He says that he said the following. He said that given the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces, which are in the hundreds every day, hundreds of troops every day, it's not entirely right to hold the town. Things don't look great for them at the moment. Well, that's an understatement. And then he goes on to say they are nonetheless throwing in reserves there. They are preparing new reserves. They have now moved a new battalion there. But the question is, how will they deploy it there on roads that are controlled by our artillery? So Gagin is saying that the Ukrainians are trying to reinforce their positions in Bakhmut itself, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to do so because even though they had a whole battalion ready to be sent into Bakhmut, it's unable, in effect, to get in because Russian artillery now controls all the roads. And the last point was again made by Gagin in that same interview. Our artillery, our vehicles are already in the city. They control almost half of Artyomsk. Half of Artyomsk. Artyomsk is, of course, Bakhmut. Now, other people on the Russian side are talking about the actions of Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, the fact that they're trying to rush troops to try to prevent the situation in Bakhmut collapsing. And again, we have more comments, this time from another one of our old friends, retired Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Marochko. And he's been talking, as I understand it, to TASS, where, by the way, I should say, I've been getting all of these reports from. And Marochko says the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces is trying to prevent a complete encirclement of Artyomsk, in other words, Bakhmut, This is why they redeploy more or less combat-ready units to the west of the town. Positions in the area of supply roads have been reinforced. And Marochka also noted that the Ukrainian forces stepped up artillery operations and were shelling Russian troops from the town of Chasov Yar. And that's, in other words, the Ukrainians have not given up in Bakhmut, even though their troops are in effect encircled there. So lots of information coming, as I said, from various Russian representatives. And, of course, we've also heard a great deal from Yevgeny Prigozhin over the last couple of days. And he's again been active. He says that Ukraine is now trying to build up more of its forces in and around Bakhmut. And he's talking about a possible Ukrainian breakthrough attempt to Bakhmut. He's identified various units of the Ukrainian army in Slavyansk, in Chasov Yar, in Seversk, that could, in theory, be used to carry out a operation to break the siege of Bakhmut. He says that if everybody on the Russian side does their work properly, then such a breakthrough will not occur, and the Russian victory in Bakhmut will be achieved. But he makes it clear that this is far from over, and he repeats, of course, his now classic constant demand for more ammunition for his artillery forces. So the picture that we're getting from the Russians is of the Ukrainians suffering extremely heavy losses in Bakhmut and being effectively in a state of encirclement, and the Ukrainians nonetheless still trying to hold on, trying to retain control of at least Bakhmut, or at least part of Bakhmut, that part of Bakhmut that they control, considering a breakthrough attempt, an attempt to break these Russian positions around Bakhmut, and of a battle that in Gagin's words has turned into a black hole for Ukrainian manpower, and with claims also that some Ukrainian troops just aren't able to cope anymore and have been fleeing from Bakhmut in small groups in a chaotic way, suggesting, as I said, that this has not been organized by Kiev. Anyway, that's what various Russian officials have been saying. There's also been certain comments by the most senior Russian military official of all, who is the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. Now, the account of what he's been saying has not been yet published in English on the Russian Defense Ministry website, but it's been widely reported in the Russian media, including by TASS. And I'm going first to the rather short dispatch from TASS about Shoigu's words, which focuses principally on Ukrainian casualties. And TASS's report about Shoigu's comments made at a conference in the Russian Defense Ministry reads as follows. The losses of Ukrainian troops jumped by 40% in February, surpassing 11,000 men, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said during a conference call with top commanders of the Russian armed forces. There's considerable growth of losses among the personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces. In February alone, they increased by more than 40% compared with January and totaled more than 11,000 servicemen. In connection with this, it's surprising how the Kiev regime doesn't care about its people, tolerating any cost to human life to please its Western handlers. Now, I should say that if you go back and look at Shoigu's report from January, in January he claimed that 6,500 Ukrainian troops had been killed over the course of January. He's now saying that in February that jumped to 11,000, and of course not all of them will have been killed in BAKHMUT, but it's likely, if Shoigu's claims are true, which of course I cannot corroborate, but it's likely that most of them were. So that's what TASS reports Shoigu is saying. But other parts of the Russian media have spoken at much greater length about his words, and they're quite interesting. Now, this is what has been said by one particular Russian newspaper, RGRU. Now, I want to stress this is not an official translation. This is basically a machine translation, somewhat polished up by myself. But anyway, this is the headline. Shoigu, the capture of Artyomovsk, in other words, BAKHMUT, will allow the Russian armed forces to continue the offensive deep into the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. And he goes on to say, taking control of the city of BAKHMUT in the Donetsk People's Republic will allow the Russian armed forces to carry out a further offensive deep into the defenses of the Ukrainian army. And this was stated by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu during a conference call with the leadership of the Russian armed forces. And according to Shoigu, the liberation of, well, it's referred to as Artyomovsk here, but we're talking about BAKHMUT, is currently underway. The city is an important center of defense of the Ukrainian military in Donbass. Taking it under control will allow further offensive actions deep into the defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine. And Shoigu also recalled the liberation as a result of the offensive of the Russian armed forces in the Donetsk and Kupiansk directions of Nikolaevka, Dvorechnoye, Krasnaya Gora, Gryanikovka, and Paraskovievka. Note, by the way, it doesn't seem to be mentioning the role of the Wagner Group in liberating all these places, but we'll put that aside. In addition, and then it goes on to say, Shoigu drew attention to the fact that NATO's support for Kiev has not yet led to the success of the armed forces of Ukraine on the battlefield. On the contrary, there is a significant increase in losses amongst the personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. Thus, according to the Minister of Defense, in February, the losses of the Ukrainian army increased by more than 40% compared to January and reached over 11,000. So that's what one Russian newspaper is reporting Shoigu as saying. So if we read this carefully, what Shoigu is saying is BAKHMUT is captured. We're not going to stop. We're going to press on. We're going to advance more deeply into Ukrainian positions. We're going to launch offensives to capture even more ground from Ukraine. And he also talks about BAKHMUT there as, in effect, the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense system. Well, that's what the Russians have been saying. What have the Ukrainians been saying? Well, yesterday I spoke about a report from Bild Zeitung, which spoke about the enormous losses Ukraine has suffered in BAKHMUT, defending BAKHMUT. And it also said that General Zaluzhny, some weeks ago, asked President Zelensky to endorse a withdrawal from BAKHMUT, but that Zelensky refused. Well, a few hours later, perhaps in response to that Bild Zeitung article, President Zelensky's office published this statement. On Monday, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, held a regular meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The commanders of the operational and strategic groups reported on the situation on the main front lines. The members of the staff considered the situation in Bakhmut in particular. Assessing the course of the defense operation, the President asked Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, and Commander of the Operational and Strategic Grouping of Troops, Khortytsia Alexander Syrsky, about further actions in the Bakhmut direction. They, that's to say Zaluzhny and Syrsky, spoke in favour of continuing the defence operation and further strengthening our positions in Bakhmut. So, according to Zelensky's office, the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian military leadership, is united in its determination to defend and hold on to Bakhmut. And we saw Gagin talking about the fact that Ukraine has tried to send another battalion into Bakhmut to try to reinforce the troops there. Prigozhin has been talking about Ukraine also sending troops close to Bakhmut. Marochko has been saying the same thing. All the indications are that Ukraine is not giving up on this battle. At least the leadership of Ukraine are not giving up on this battle. Some troops may be leaving Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops may be leaving Bakhmut. Maybe they're doing so in scattered groups under command from their superiors, or maybe they're fleeing. But the Ukrainian leadership as a whole, despite the critical situation, despite the fact that Bakhmut now finds itself in a cauldron, are apparently determined to keep the battle going. And that, of course, opens up the question of whether indeed we are going to see this Ukrainian attempt to break in to Bakhmut. And that's an interesting question to which, of course, I am not in a position to give an answer. I would have thought that for Ukraine to do that, it would be extremely difficult. I would have thought that that would be a challenging operation indeed, and perhaps not even a wise one. I would have thought that it would make more sense to try and extract these troops from Bakhmut, perhaps negotiating some sort of truce to allow them to withdraw, rather than to send more men and more machines and more troops to attack Russian forces now that are encircling Bakhmut. But the possibility of an attack does exist, and you see from his comments that Prigozhin himself takes it very seriously. He feels that the military, the forces that are Russian forces that are besieging Bakhmut need to be prepared for this, and he's talking about the need to do that, and he says if this isn't done, well, it will be a debacle for the Russian side, which it would be, by the way. So, anyway, we'll see what the Ukrainians do. In this connection, I saw a very interesting report. I think it was again on Slavyangrad, the Telegram channel that provides a lot of very interesting and helpful commentary about the progress of the war and provides reports of the actual fighting, which, as I said, on balance, I've found consistently reliable. But anyway, I did read a report that there's been some suggestions that before Ukraine launches its much touted spring offensive, some of its troops, it will use some of its troops who've been prepared for this offensive, it will test them out in fighting somewhere on the front line, and that this will be done in order to perfect and establish whether the training and the tactics that these troops have received has been up to the right standard, and whether an offensive is possible. And anyway, basically to give these troops experience of actual fighting before they undertake an offensive itself. And this particular report suggested that some of these units might be used in an attempt to break into BAKHMUT, and that this might happen at some point over the next 2 weeks. Well, it's possible, and it's consistent with some of the reports we've been hearing about a pile-up of Ukrainian troops and equipment, Western equipment and artillery in Chasov Yar, and perhaps something like that is indeed being planned. But I'm sure, as I said, that the Russians will be keeping an eye out for it, and we'll see what will happen. Anyway, it's clear that Ukraine is not prepared to give up BAKHMUT at this point, despite it becoming a black hole, despite the enormous losses that Ukraine has suffered as a result of its commitment to hold on to BAKHMUT. And some kind of Ukrainian attack to relieve the garrison in BAKHMUT is far from impossible or even unlikely. Meanwhile, I am going to say something about the state of the losses that Ukraine is suffering in BAKHMUT, because we're now getting all kinds of reports about this and about the increasing demoralization of Ukrainian soldiers who have been defending BAKHMUT. And I should say that these reports, which are from Bild Zeitung and from the Kiev Independent, I've taken from the Moon of Alabama, and that's where I found these extracts. Anyway, let's start with Bild Zeitung. This is the report that appeared, which spoke about dissension between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. And I'll read the passage. President Volodymyr Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, have conflicting views on how the military should handle the situation in BAKHMUT, according to unnamed sources within the Ukrainian political leadership. Bild writes that Zaluzhny was deliberating a tactical withdrawal from BAKHMUT weeks ago over concern for the well-being of his troops. The Ukrainian government told Bild that remaining in BAKHMUT was the right decision due to the serious damage it inflicted on Russian military personnel and equipment. However, according to other sources, the situation is at risk of becoming untenable. The vast majority of soldiers in BAKHMUT do not understand why the city is being held, a Ukrainian military analyst told Bild on condition of anonymity. And then there's been a really very distressing report, also covered by the Moon of Alabama, from the Kiev and Independent. And it talks about how multiple defenders of this embattled city, that's to say BAKHMUT in Donetsk, feel that they're in a similar boat, in other words, that they're being sacrificed, according to interviews with more than a dozen soldiers currently fighting in and or around BAKHMUT. During their brief visits to the nearby town of Konstantinovka, Ukrainian infantry told the Kiev Independent of unprepared, poorly trained battalions being thrown into the front line meat grinder to survive as best they could with little support from armoured vehicles, mortars, artillery, drones, and tactical information. And then there's extensive quotations from two soldiers called Sergei, both in their 40s, and they say that they lack everything that would support their defense, that Russian artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers are often allowed to strike Ukrainian positions for hours or days without being shot down by Ukrainian heavy weapons. Some complained of poor coordination and situational awareness, allowing this to happen or making it even worse. And these are obviously more people than just the two Sergeys, but we then go on to read. Mortarmen spoke of extreme ammunition scarcity and having to use weapons dating back to World War II. Drones that are supposed to provide critical reconnaissance information are also scarce and are being lost at very high rates in some parts of the battlefield. All this leads to terrifying casualties. Remember, this is the Kiev Independent talking about the situation of Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut. All this leads to terrifying casualties of both dead and wounded. The battalion came in the middle of December. Between all the different platoons, there were 500 of us, says Boris, a combat medic from Odessa Oblast fighting around Bakhmut. A month ago, there were literally 150 of us. So this battalion has gone down from 500 to just 150. And then the older Sergei is quoted by the Kiev Independent as saying, when you go out to the position, it's not even a 50% chance that you'll come out of there alive. It's more like 30-70. And there's then a very interesting discussion from the two Sergeys about actual Russian tactics. And as the Moon of Alabama, Bernhardt correctly says, this essentially refutes the claims about waves of Russian troops being launched recklessly to try and overwhelm Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut. And the Kiev Independent says this: the older Sergei says that the enemy likes to send a team of 3 or 4 expendable foot soldiers to attack and make the Ukrainians expose themselves by shooting at them. At that point, the more elite forces zero in on the defenders' position. Once they begin exchanging fire, the Ukrainians are struck with heavier weapons, like Russian mortars and rockets from Grad multiple launch rocket systems, or BMP infantry fighting vehicles and BTR armored personnel carriers with machine guns. They get the positions where we are, establish the coordinates, then they hit us from 7 to 9 kilometers out with mortars, as well as from closer by with grenade launchers, says the older Sergei. They wait for the house to fall, so we have to jump out, the building catches fire, and then they try to finish us off. And then the younger Sergei chips in, their birds come out and they chase us with fire. And he's now referring to Russian drones, like quadcopters and Orlan-10 fixed-wing drones that spot distant heavy weapons. They hit accurately. And as Russia is destroying more and more buildings, Ukrainians keep losing more and more places where they can reliably take cover. Boris, the medic, says people have been lost when their entrenched positions collapsed from heavy Russian fire, suffocating them. I'll put it like this: we should get our people out, because if we don't take off, then in the next few weeks it's going to be bad. A mortarman named Ilya agrees that Bakhmut is practically encircled. And then Kiev Independent goes on to say multiple soldiers say Bakhmut troops are barely given enough time to learn to shoot a rifle. Sometimes their training is just 2 weeks before they're dropped into the hottest parts of the most intense current battle of the war. They would have preferred for troops to get a minimum of 2 or 3 months of training before being deployed to such a hot spot. 2 weeks live training and they're sent here. You can't do that, says the older Sergei. Or it's a person who once served in the army. How long ago was that? Obviously, they forgot everything. We were promised that we wouldn't be sent to the zero line right away, that at first we'd be sent to the second or third line, And then we came here in the middle of the night, and they immediately sent us to Bakhmut. According to both soldiers named Sergei, most brigades are insufficiently trained and lack the experience for an environment as brutal as Bakhmut. People are taken at night to a place they'd never seen before, and the battle starts in the morning. This is why positions are abandoned. People are there for the first time, says the younger Sergei. I went to a position 3 times and was given 6 people who hadn't fought at all before. We had a few dead and wounded that had to be evacuated. Our people are not being protected. And then another Ukrainian soldier, Alexander, confirms that while some battalions fighting in Bakhmut are well trained and ready, most of them aren't, and many were thrown in at night without much preparation. Yes, that's true. My battalion was not prepared. After 5 months without a single break from the fighting, only half of Alexander's battalion is left. They shouldn't have rushed to throw everyone in there, says the younger Sergei. Better to abandon those positions. Who cares? It's better to train people properly. So that's on the Kiev Independent, as I said, courtesy of the Moon of Alabama. You get a sense of what's been happening in Bakhmut. Ukraine's been throwing in ill-trained troops to try to hold on to Bakhmut. These troops have been killed in huge numbers. Many more of them have been wounded. Perhaps it's unsurprising that, according to the Russians, some of them are trying to flee across the fields. Well, that's Bakhmut.